Most people think Peter Griffin is just a loud, dumb cartoon dad, good for a laugh and nothing else. A punchline built to embarrass his family and move on to the next joke. That's the whole character, right? One writer who worked on the show has said the opposite was true from the very beginning. What Seth MacFarlane actually built him from might change how you see every episode after this one. This is the entire story of Peter Griffin, the college films that became Peter Griffin. Long before Peter Griffin ever sat on a couch in a cartoon town called Quahog, a young man was sitting in a small dorm room in Rhode Island, working on a school project. This was the middle of the 1990s, and the young man was a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, a school known for training artists, painters, and animators. His name was Seth MacFarlane, and he had come to this school to learn how to make cartoons. Every student at a school like this has to finish a big final project before they can graduate. This project is often called a thesis. It is meant to show everything a student has learned during their years of study, all packed into one piece of work. For an animation student, a thesis often takes the shape of a short film. It has to have characters, a story, and a style that feels like the student's own. Seth MacFarlane spent a good part of his time at school building his thesis film, and he gave it a simple name. He called it The Life of Larry. The film told the story of a middle-aged man named Larry Cummings. Larry was not a hero or a genius. He was just an average guy, the kind of person you might see walking down the street without a second thought. He had a wife named Lois and a son named Milt. But the most important character, next to Larry himself, was his dog. This dog was named Steve, and unlike most dogs in cartoons at the time, Steve could think clearly, speak with confidence, and act far smarter than his owner. The strange and funny gap between a foolish man and his sharp, clever dog became the heart of the whole short film. At first, almost nobody outside of MacFarlane's own circle of friends had seen this film. It played mostly in his dorm room, shown to roommates and classmates the way any student might show off a project they had worked hard on. There was no big premiere, no theater, no wide audience. It was just a young man sharing something he had made with the people closest to him. Many creative ideas start this small. A short film in a college dorm room does not usually feel like the beginning of something that will later be watched by millions of people, but that is exactly what happened here. The reason The Life of Larry did not stay stuck inside a dorm room was because of a teacher. One of MacFarlane's professors at the Rhode Island School of Design saw real promise in the short film and decided to do something about it. This professor took the film and sent it to a company called Hanna-Barbera. For anyone who grew up watching cartoons in the 20th century, that name would have meant a great deal. Hanna-Barbera was one of the biggest and most well-known cartoon studios in the world. It was the studio behind shows like The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and Yogi Bear, cartoons that had entertained families for decades before MacFarlane was even born. Getting noticed by a studio like this was not a small thing for a college student. It was the kind of opportunity that could change the direction of an entire career. Hanna-Barbera watched The Life of Larry, and they liked what they saw enough to hire Seth MacFarlane. He became a writer and animator for the studio, working on projects there while he kept developing the ideas he had started back in school. Being hired by a studio that big, right out of college, was a strong sign that the people running Hanna-Barbera saw something special in the way MacFarlane told jokes and built characters. His sense of humor, and the strange chemistry between a slow-witted man and his smart-talking dog, had caught the attention of professionals who had spent their whole careers making cartoons. While working at Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane did not simply set his college project aside. Instead, he built on it. He created a new short film that kept the same basic idea, a middle-aged man and his intelligent dog, but gave the characters a fresh story to work with. This new short was called Larry and Steve, and it kept the same two characters from his thesis film at its center, though this time the project was made under the wing of a real studio rather than as a school assignment. The bond between the two characters, one clumsy and simple, the other calm and clever, stayed exactly the kind of pairing that had worked so well in the original dorm room screenings. Larry and Steve did not stay hidden the way the first film had. It found its way onto television, airing as part of a series on Cartoon Network called World Premiere Toons. This was a block of programming built specifically to give new short cartoons a chance to be seen by a wide audience. It offered a stage for young animators and fresh ideas, giving viewers a taste of work that had never been broadcast before. For someone like MacFarlane, having his short land inside a block like this meant that Larry and Steve were no longer just characters shared between friends. Now they were being watched by anyone tuning into Cartoon Network at the right time, a much bigger audience than a handful of college students crowded into a dorm room. During his time at school, Seth MacFarlane also made a friendship that would end up shaping his cartoon world for years to come. While studying animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, he met a fellow student student named Mike Henry. At the time, this was simply one college student meeting another, two people sharing classes and interests in the same small program. Neither of them could have known just how far that friendship would carry. Years later, Mike Henry would become one of the most important voices behind Family Guy, eventually giving life to several characters on the show, including a soft-spoken man named Cleveland Brown. The town where Family Guy takes place would also end up shaped in part by people McFarlane knew from his time at school. A simple college friendship formed in classrooms and hallways at RISD would end up woven into the very fabric of a show that had not even been invented yet. It is worth sitting with just how ordinary all of this looked at the time. There was no plan for a hit television show. There was no talk of a family living in a fictional town. No dog who could speak in full sentences to everyone around him. No baby plotting elaborate schemes in a crib. There was only a college student working on assignments, a professor who believed in that student's talent enough to make a phone call or send a package, and a big cartoon studio willing to take a chance on someone fresh out of school. Each of these steps looked small enough on its own. A thesis film, a mailed submission, a short student job at a big studio, a follow-up short film, a single college friendship. None of these felt like the start of a television empire while they were happening. They simply felt like one young man doing his best with the opportunities placed in front of him. What makes this beginning worth remembering is how directly it connects to everything that came after. The gap between a foolish man and his intelligent companion, first drawn out in a dorm room short film, would later become the gap between Peter Griffin and his dog Brian. The wife named Lois in The Life of Larry would keep her name when the character crossed over into the new show. Even the son, Milt, was part of the earliest sketch of a family that would eventually be redrawn and renamed for a much bigger audience. Nothing about Family Guy came from nowhere. It grew, piece by piece, out of a student film that almost nobody outside a small dorm room ever would have seen if a professor had not decided to send it somewhere bigger. There's something calming about knowing that even the biggest and most famous cartoon families started out this small. A story that would one day fill hundreds of episodes and run for more than 2 decades began as a simple idea about a man and his dog, shared first with roommates, then with a professor, then with a cartoon studio built on decades of trusted history, and then finally with an entire television audience watching a new short block called World Premiere Toons. Step by step, without any grand plan laid out in advance, the pieces that would become Peter Griffin were being placed on the table. By the time Larry and Steve had aired, and Seth MacFarlane had spent time working inside a major cartoon studio, the raw shape of something new had already formed. A middle-aged man with no filter. A dog with more sense than his owner. A wife who would keep her name across every version of the story. A friend from college who would end up voicing one of the most familiar characters in the entire show. All of these threads existed quietly in the background, waiting for the next big step to pull them together into something much larger than a short film played for classmates. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That next step would not come from a professor or a college hallway. It would come from television executives at a major broadcast network, watching these very shorts and imagining something far bigger than either had been on their own. What they saw in Larry and his dog Steve would lead to a pitch, a small budget, and a 15-minute presentation that would decide whether the world would ever get the chance to meet the Griffin family at all. Section 2. The Pilot and the Fox Greenlight. By the time Seth MacFarlane had spent real time working inside a professional cartoon studio, he was no longer just a college student with a school project under his arm. He had turned 24 years old in the fall of 1998. Still a young man by almost any measure, but he now had something that most people his age did not have. He had already been hired by one of the biggest names in the history of American cartoons, and he had already seen 2 of his own short films reach real audiences outside of a dorm room. That combination of youth and early professional experience is rare. Most people at 24 are still trying to figure out what their first real job will look like. MacFarlane had already worked one, and it had been at a company that made some of the most beloved cartoons in television history. Still, working as a writer and animator for someone else's studio is very different from being given the keys to your own show. At Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane was one voice among many, contributing to projects that belonged to the company rather than to him personally. The characters he had built back in school, the slow-witted man and his sharp-talking dog, were his own creation, born out of his own imagination and his own sense of humor. If those characters were ever going to grow into something bigger than a short film played on a cable block, someone with real power in the television industry would need to see them and believe they were worth building a full show around. That is exactly what began to happen in 1998. A television network does not simply stumble across across a good idea and put it on air the next week. There is a process behind almost everything that appears on a screen, and that process usually starts with something called a pitch. A pitch is when a person with an idea sits down, often with executives who have the power to say yes or no, and tries to explain why their idea deserves a chance. It might be a spoken explanation, a short written outline, or, in the case of a visual medium, like animation, something the audience can actually watch and judge on the spot. For someone hoping to create their own animated show, the strongest kind of pitch is often the simplest one. Show rather than tell. Let the network see exactly what the finished product might look like, instead of asking them to imagine it based on words alone. This is the situation Seth MacFarlane found himself in during the middle of 1998. The Fox Broadcasting Company had heard about the young animator and the short films he had already made, and they were curious enough to ask him to come in with something they could actually watch. In May of 1998, MacFarlane pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox. A pilot, in television terms, is a sample episode built to show what an entire series could become if it were picked up. It is meant to answer a simple question for the people deciding whether to spend money on a show. Does this work? Do these characters feel alive? Is there enough here to build dozens, maybe even hundreds of future episodes? Making a pilot is not a small task, even a short one. Fox gave MacFarlane a very specific set of terms. They offered him a budget of $50,000 and suggested that he build a 15-minute short to bring back to them. $50,000 might sound like a large amount of money to an average person, but inside the television and film industry, it is a tiny number. Full-length television pilots for major networks often cost many times that amount, sometimes running into the millions of dollars once actors, sets, cameras, and full production crews are involved. Animation in particular is expensive and slow to produce, since every single frame of movement has to be drawn, colored, and put together by hand, or by early digital tools, rather than simply filmed with a camera in front of real people. A budget of $50,000 for an animated pilot meant that MacFarlane would not have the resources of a large studio behind him. He would need to rely heavily on his own two hands and his own skills as an animator. Rather than treating this as a limitation that would hold him back, MacFarlane leaned into it. He built a presentation for Fox executives largely by himself, working out of his own home instead of a large studio space filled with a big team of artists. He hand-animated a good portion of the material himself, drawing and shaping the movement of these characters frame by frame, the same kind of patient, careful work he would have learned and practiced at Hanna-Barbera. There is something worth sitting with in this detail. The show that would go on to run for more than 2 decades, air hundreds of episodes, and become one of the most recognized cartoons on television, did not begin with a large team of animators working in a big studio building. It began with one young man working largely alone at home, drawing character by character and scene by scene, trying to prove that an idea he had carried since his college years deserved a real chance on national television. The characters he brought into this new presentation were built directly from the foundation laid in his earlier student films. The clumsy, simple-minded man from The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve was reshaped and given a new name. Larry became Peter. His clever, sharp-tongued dog Steve became Brian. The wife character, who had already been named Lois back in the college thesis film, kept that same name as she crossed over into this new project. This was not a brand new set of characters invented from scratch to impress a network. It was the same core family MacFarlane had been quietly building and refining since his time as a student, now redrawn, renamed in part, and expanded into something with a stronger shape and a clearer sense of who these people were. When it came time to actually present this material to Fox, MacFarlane did not simply hand over a finished tape and walk away. He sat in front of the people who had the power to decide whether Peter, Lois, Brian, and the rest of this family would ever be seen by anyone beyond that room. 2 of the most important people watching that pitch were Fox television executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden. At the time, both held significant positions of authority over what kinds of shows Fox would choose to develop and eventually broadcast. Executives like these see a large number of pitches over the course of their careers, most of which never make it anywhere close to a television screen. Being able to stand out in front of people who have likely heard countless pitches before is no small accomplishment for a young creator presenting largely self-made material. Newman and Walden were impressed by what they saw. This response mattered enormously because their reaction stood between MacFarlane's characters remaining a small personal project and those same characters becoming the center of a nationally broadcast television series. Being impressed by a presentation is not the same as guaranteeing a show gets made, but it is the necessary first step. Without genuine interest from the people holding decision-making power, even the strongest creative idea has no path forward inside a large network system. him. The fact that two senior Fox executives came away from this pilot believing in what MacFarlane had built gave his characters the opening they needed. Following this positive reaction, Fox made a decision that would end up changing the direction of MacFarlane's entire life and career. The studio commissioned 13 episodes of the new show. Commissioning episodes means far more than simply liking an idea. It means committing real money, real production time, and real air time on a national broadcast schedule to turning that idea into a finished, repeatable series. 13 episodes is often used as a standard first order for a new television series, giving a show enough room to establish its characters, its tone, and its voice, while still limiting the network's financial risk in case the show does not connect with viewers once it actually airs. For MacFarlane, an order of 13 episodes meant that the family he had first sketched out in a college dorm room years earlier was now officially going to become a real television show. It is worth pausing here to think about what kind of environment this new show would be entering. Fox was not starting from zero when it came to adult-oriented animated comedy. Nearly a decade earlier, in 1989, Fox had begun airing an animated series about another family, one built around a bumbling father, a patient wife, and a group of mismatched children. That earlier show had gone on to become one of the most successful and influential television programs in American history, proving to networks and audiences alike that a cartoon did not have to be made only for children. It could speak to adults, tackle everyday family life, and use humor to comment on the world in ways that live-action shows sometimes struggled to match. By the time MacFarlane brought his own pilot into Fox in 1998, the network already understood that animated comedy aimed at older viewers could succeed in a major way. This earlier success likely made Fox more open to taking a chance on a new creator with a new animated family, since the network had already seen firsthand what this kind of show could accomplish when it worked. Still, being open to the idea of animated adult comedy in general is very different from being certain that any one particular new show will succeed. Every new series, no matter how promising its pilot looks, carries real risk. Audiences might not connect with the characters. The humor might not translate from a short pilot into a full season of storytelling. The show might get lost on the schedule, buried opposite stronger competition on other channels. None of this was guaranteed to go well, simply because Fox had commissioned 13 episodes. The commission was an opportunity, not a promise of success. What happened next would depend entirely on how these new episodes were made and how audiences responded once they finally had the chance to watch. Between the moment Fox committed to those first 13 episodes and the moment the show actually reached television screens, there was a great deal of work still ahead. Building even one episode of an animated series takes far longer than making a single live-action episode of a typical sitcom. Every character has to be drawn in every pose. Every expression has to be captured through careful animation. Backgrounds have to be built and colored. Voices have to be recorded and matched precisely to lip movements. Music has to be composed and placed, and all of these pieces have to be edited together into something that flows smoothly from start to finish. This kind of production takes months of steady, detailed effort, long before a single episode is ready for broadcast. During this stretch of production, MacFarlane and the people working alongside him were shaping the version of this world that audiences would eventually meet. The family living in a modest house, the small town they called home, and the collection of neighbors, friends, and co-workers surrounding them all had to be built out in far more detail than a short 15-minute pilot could ever show. A pilot exists to prove that an idea has potential. A full series has to prove that the idea can be repeated, episode after episode, without running out of things to say or losing what made it interesting in the first place. The town this family would call home was given the name Quahog, a fictional place set in the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island held real meaning for MacFarlane personally, since it was the state where he had studied animation and where his early creative ideas had first taken shape. Placing this new show in a fictional Rhode Island town allowed him to build a setting that felt specific and grounded, rather than a vague, placeless American suburb with no real personality. Even something as simple as choosing where a fictional family lives says something about how a creator wants their world to feel, and MacFarlane rooted this one firmly in the region that had shaped his own path toward becoming an animator. As production moved forward, Fox also had to decide exactly when this new show would debut and where it would sit on the broadcast schedule. Placement on a schedule matters enormously for any new television series. A show that airs at a strong time, following another program with a large built-in audience, has a much better chance of being seen by a wide range of viewers than a show buried in a weak time slot with little natural lead-in audience. Fox chose to give this new series a high-profile launch, a decision that reflected reflected genuine confidence in what McFarlane and his team had built. Finally, after months of steady work turning a 15-minute pilot into a full-length premiere episode, the day arrived. On January 31st, 1999, Family Guy officially made its television debut. The Griffin family, the same family whose earliest roots stretched all the way back to a college dorm room screening of The Life of Larry, appeared together on national television for the very first time. The episode that introduced them to the world was called Death Has a Shadow. This was the moment where every earlier step, the college short films, the professor who mailed a project to a major studio, the hiring at Hanna-Barbera, the friendship with a fellow student who would later become a key voice on the show, the $50,000 budget, the hand-animated home pitch, the meeting with Newman and Walden, and the commission of 13 episodes, all came together into a single moment. A cartoon family that had existed only in sketches, short films, and production rooms for years was now sitting inside television sets across the country, ready to be judged by real audiences for the very first time. It is easy, looking back from a distance of more than 2 decades, to treat this premiere as something that was destined to happen. The show would go on to become one of the longest-running series in the history of American television, recognized by millions of people around the world. But nothing about that outcome was guaranteed on the night of January 31st, 1999. At that moment, Family Guy was simply a new show attempting to find its footing, no different in principle from countless other new series that had launched on television and quietly faded away within a season or two. The only thing separating Family Guy from those forgotten shows was what would happen next, once real viewers, real critics, and real ratings numbers began to respond to what McFarlane and his team had created. There is something valuable in remembering the show at this exact stage, right at the very beginning, before any of its future success was decided. At this point, Peter Griffin was not yet a character recognized by people all over the world. He was a brand new face on a brand new show, voiced by a 25-year-old creator who had built much of the very first pilot with his own 2 hands in his own home. The version of Peter that appeared in Death Has a Shadow was the product of years of quiet development, starting all the way back with a slow, witted man named Larry, sketched out for a school project, refined and reshaped step by step until Fox finally agreed to give him, and the family around him, a real chance on national television. None of the elements that would eventually define the show, the long-running jokes, the wide cast of neighbors and friends, the many seasons still to come, existed in a fully developed form on that very first night. All of that still had to be built, tested, and shaped through the work still ahead. What did exist, right from that premiere, was the basic foundation. A family living in a fictional Rhode Island town, a father with a distinctive personality already beginning to take shape, a talking dog serving as one of his closest companions, and a creator who had spent years quietly working toward exactly this moment, refusing to let an idea that started in a small dorm room disappear before it had the chance to reach a much wider audience. The path that led here was not fast, and it was not simple. It took a professor willing to mail a student film to a major studio. It took a studio willing to hire a very young animator based on the strength of that film. It took a friendship formed in a college classroom that would end up shaping the sound of an entire fictional town. It took a network willing to hand a relatively unproven creator a modest budget and a real opportunity to prove himself. And it took countless hours of quiet, detailed work, much of it done by one person working largely alone, to turn a short pitch into a full-length premiere episode ready for national broadcast. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Getting a show onto television, however, is only ever the beginning of the story, never the end of it. A premiere episode can introduce a family to the world, but it cannot, on its own, explain who that family truly is underneath the surface. Audiences watching Death Has a Shadow for the first time were meeting Peter Griffin without knowing anything yet about where his voice had come from, why he sounded the way he did, or which real person had unknowingly shaped one of the most recognized cartoon voices in modern television. That story, the story of exactly how Peter came to sound and act the way he does, still remained untold on the night this show finally reached the screen. Section 3. A voice built from a security guard. Every character who has ever appeared on a screen had to start somewhere. Before Peter Griffin became one of the most recognized voices in modern animation, before millions of people around the world could hear just a few words from him and instantly know exactly who was speaking, he was simply an idea inside the mind of one young man trying to figure out how a middle-aged father from Rhode Island should actually sound. Getting that sound sound right, more than almost anything else about the character, would end up shaping the entire personality of Peter Griffin for decades to come. Seth MacFarlane did not invent this voice out of thin air. He built it from something he had actually experienced in real life during his years as a student at the Rhode Island School of Design. Around the campus, there were security guards whose job was to keep watch over the buildings, the students, and the property late into the night. Students walk past guards like this every day without giving them much thought. For most people, a security guard is simply part of the background of daily life, someone who checks badges or watches over a building, rarely someone who becomes the basis for a character seen by millions of people. For MacFarlane, one of these guards became something far more important than background noise. That guard's name was Paul Timmons. While MacFarlane was studying animation on campus, he crossed paths with Timmons the same way any student might run into a familiar security guard again and again over the course of a few years. Through these repeated encounters, MacFarlane began to notice something distinct about the way Timmons spoke. It was not just his accent, though that accent would end up playing an enormous role in shaping Peter's voice as well. It was something about the way Timmons expressed himself, a kind of openness that most people learn to hold back once they reach adulthood. MacFarlane later described this quality in a simple, memorable way. He said that people like Timmons had no self-editing mechanism. Most people, when they are talking to others, run their thoughts through a kind of filter before the words actually leave their mouth. They think about whether a comment might embarrass them, whether it makes sense, whether it is something they should really be saying out loud in that moment. According to MacFarlane, Timmons did not seem to have that filter in the same way most people do. Whatever thought entered his mind seemed to come straight out of his mouth without pausing to consider how it might land. MacFarlane explained this by saying that everything inside a person like that comes out directly, with no gateway standing in the way. This detail matters enormously when thinking about who Peter Griffin eventually became as a character. A huge amount of the humor built around Peter across hundreds of episodes comes from exactly this quality. He often says whatever thought happens to be sitting in his head at that exact second, regardless of whether it is appropriate, kind, or even something he fully understands himself. That specific kind of unfiltered, blunt honesty did not come from a writer's room brainstorming session or a focus group testing out jokes. It came from MacFarlane paying close attention to a real security guard he knew during his college years and recognizing something worth building an entire character around. MacFarlane has also spoken more broadly about the kind of people who shaped Peter's personality, beyond just this one specific guard. He grew up in New England, and he has described knowing what felt like countless versions of this same type of person while he was growing up there. These were the kinds of men who spoke loudly, said whatever came to mind, and never seemed particularly worried about how their words might be received by the people around them. Timmons may have been the clearest, most direct model for Peter's actual voice, but the broader personality behind that voice was drawn from an entire region MacFarlane had spent years living in and observing closely. Once MacFarlane had this voice in mind, he had to figure out how to actually perform it himself, since he would end up being the one voicing Peter across the entire run of the show. This was not a simple decision made purely out of creative preference. Money played a real part in it as well. When Family Guy was first getting started, the show did not have a large budget to work with, the same $50,000 starting point that had shaped how the very first pilot got made. Hiring a large number of separate professional voice actors for every single character would have added significant cost to a production that was already being built on tight resources. By voicing several characters himself, MacFarlane was able to help keep the show within reach financially during those early, uncertain years. But cost was not the only reason he chose to keep performing these voices himself, even long after the show had grown into a major financial success with far more resources available. MacFarlane has explained that he also simply prefers having the freedom that comes with doing the voices personally. When a creator writes the words a character says and also performs those same words out loud, there is no gap between the intention behind a line and the way it actually gets delivered. Nothing gets lost in translation between one person's script and another actor's separate interpretation of that script. MacFarlane could adjust his own timing, tone, and delivery in the exact moment of recording, shaping the performance however felt most true to the character he had originally imagined. Despite having created the character and having performed the voice for so many years, MacFarlane has openly admitted that Peter's voice is not an easy one for him to do. In interviews, he has specifically pointed to Peter as one of the more difficult voices among all the characters he performs across his shows. This might come as a surprise to viewers, since Peter is the character MacFarlane has voiced the longest and most often, appearing in nearly every single episode across more than 2 decades. Yet the physical effort involved in producing that particular gruff, distinctive sound, episode after episode, season after season, has remained genuinely demanding for him, even after doing it for so many years. The voice itself itself was only one half of bringing Peter to life. The other half was how he actually looked. Just as McFarlane did not invent Peter's voice from nothing, he also did not invent Peter's physical appearance from a blank page. Peter's design was a direct redesign of Larry, the character from McFarlane's earlier college short films. This means that the physical shape of Peter Griffin, the glasses, the round face, the overall build, all trace their roots back to a character first drawn years earlier for a student thesis project, long before Fox had ever agreed to turn this idea into a real television show. Redesigning an existing character rather than starting completely from scratch is a meaningful creative choice. It shows that McFarlane was not simply throwing out everything from his college years and beginning fresh once he had access to a real studio and a real network deal. Instead, he was building carefully on top of work he had already done, refining and adjusting an existing foundation rather than discarding it. Larry had already carried the basic idea of an average, unremarkable-looking man, someone who did not stand out as heroic or particularly special in appearance. That same basic idea carried forward directly into Peter, adjusted and sharpened until it became the specific look audiences would eventually come to recognize instantly. Peter's physical appearance settled into a fairly consistent set of features once the show was fully underway. He is drawn as a bespectacled man, meaning he wears glasses, and he is shown as overweight, working a blue-collar job, somewhere in his 40s based on how he looks on screen, though his exact age has never been stated clearly or confirmed within the show itself. His voice carries a strong regional accent that draws heavily on Rhode Island and the nearby area of eastern Massachusetts, the exact same part of the country where McFarlane had spent his own college years, listening closely to people like Paul Timmons. It is worth pointing out that although McFarlane has voiced Peter for the overwhelming majority of the show's run, there have been a small number of exceptions to this over the years. On rare occasions, other performers have stepped in to voice Peter for specific scenes within certain episodes. In one episode from the show's 5th season, an actor named Patrick Stewart voiced Peter during a short cutscene, although McFarlane returned to voicing the character for the rest of that same episode. In another episode from season 7, a guest voice was brought in to portray Peter under the effects of a storyline where his personality had been changed. In a season 8 episode, built around a scene where everything shown on screen had become Japanese, a different actor voiced Peter specifically for that particular sequence. And in a season 9 episode centered on an alternate timeline where Peter gave up drinking, yet another performer took over the role for that one version of the character. These moments stand out precisely because they are so rare within the larger picture of the show. Across hundreds of episodes spanning more than 2 decades, the vast, overwhelming majority of Peter's lines have come from Seth MacFarlane himself. The handful of exceptions exist as small, deliberate storytelling choices tied to specific, unusual circumstances within particular episodes, rather than as any kind of regular practice. If anything, these rare exceptions highlight just how closely Peter's voice is tied to one specific person. When someone else briefly takes over, even for just a scene, it becomes a notable, memorable moment, precisely because audiences are so used to hearing this character speak in one very particular way. There is a kind of quiet symmetry worth noticing across everything covered so far. A college student meets a security guard on campus and notices something distinct in the way that guard speaks. That same student writes a school thesis film starring a character who shares almost nothing in common with that guard on the surface, yet who carries a piece of him underneath. Years later, that same character gets redrawn, renamed, and given a full voice, brought to life by the very person who first noticed what made that real guard so memorable in the first place. Nothing about Peter Griffin's voice or appearance arrived instantly or by accident. Both were built slowly, shaped by real observation, real people, and years of steady creative work stretching all the way back to McFarlane's earliest days as a student. By the time the show had properly launched and settled into a regular rhythm on Fox, Peter Griffin had become far more than just a character built from a college short film and a memorable security guard. He had a face, drawn from years of refining an old design. He had a voice, shaped by real memories of real people from a specific corner of New England. And he had a performer behind him who understood more intimately than anyone else involved with the show exactly why this character spoke and behaved the way he did, because that performer had built the character out of his own personal experience and observation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this, however, explains where Peter actually came from within the story of the show itself. Audiences watching Family Guy were not simply told that Peter existed. Over time, the show slowly revealed his own personal history, the family who raised him, and and a secret about his real father that would eventually reshape everything viewers thought they understood about where this character truly began. Section 4. Peter's in-universe backstory. Every person carries a history behind them, even the people they meet only briefly. A neighbor, a coworker, someone standing in line at a store, all of these people have families, childhoods, and events in their past that shaped who they became, even if the person standing across from them will never learn any of it. The same idea holds true inside the world of a television show, even an animated one. Peter Griffin did not simply appear on screen for the first time as a fully formed adult with no past behind him. Over the years, the show slowly filled in pieces of where he actually came from, and some of those pieces turned out to be far stranger than anyone watching the early episodes could have guessed. Before looking at any of that history, it helps to start with something simple, which is his actual full name. Most viewers who watch the show casually know him only as Peter Griffin, the name used in nearly every episode by his family, friends, and coworkers. But within the show, his full name is longer and more specific than that. He is Peter Lowenbrow Griffin Sr. The word senior is included because later in the show, he becomes a father himself, and that title is often used to separate a father from a son who shares the same first and last name. Even more surprising than the middle name is the fact that his first name, Peter, was not actually the name he was given at birth. His birth name was Justin Peter Griffin. At some point, for reasons the show does not spend much time explaining in detail, he came to be known by his middle name instead of his first one, and that is the name that stuck for the rest of his life. Small details like this rarely change how a character behaves from episode to episode, but they add a layer of realism to him. Real people sometimes go by a middle name instead of the name printed on their birth certificate, and Peter turning out to be one of them is a small human touch buried inside an otherwise larger and stranger family history. The people who raised Peter were a couple named Francis and Thelma Griffin. Growing up, Peter was brought up by them within the Roman Catholic faith, a detail that shows up again and again throughout the series in different ways, whether through jokes about guilt, church, sin, or the kind of strict religious upbringing that many people from Irish Catholic and Italian Catholic communities in the northeastern United States would recognize from their own families. Being raised Catholic does not mean that Peter grew into an especially devout or serious adult. In fact, much of the humor built around his religious background comes from the contrast between how strict and serious that kind of upbringing usually is, and how loud, careless, and undisciplined Peter often behaves once he is fully grown. Still, the foundation matters. It tells viewers something about the kind of household Peter came from, even before any of the stranger details about his birth and his biological father were ever revealed. Those stranger details begin with the circumstances surrounding Peter's actual birth, a story that stands out as one of the more unusual pieces of backstory given to any character on the show. Before Peter was born, his mother Thelma traveled to Mexico City. She did not go there for a vacation or a family visit. She went there because she had decided to end her pregnancy and sought out a procedure to do so. However, during that procedure, Peter was born instead. Rather than the pregnancy ending the way Thelma had originally planned, a baby was delivered right there in the middle of the process. Faced with this completely unexpected turn of events, Thelma made the decision to smuggle the newborn baby back home to Providence, Rhode Island, rather than leaving him behind in Mexico City. From that point forward, Peter was raised in Providence as her son, alongside her husband Francis, as though this dramatic and chaotic beginning had never happened at all, at least as far as the outside world was concerned. This piece of backstory is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something important about how Family Guy tends to build its characters. A more ordinary sitcom might introduce a birth story like this with a great deal of seriousness, treating it as a heavy, emotional moment meant to explain deep pain or trauma within a family. Family Guy instead treats it as one more strange, almost darkly comic detail buried inside Peter's history, delivered the same way the show tends to deliver most of its background information about its characters, often through a brief mention, a quick flashback, or a passing joke rather than a long, dramatic scene. Yet underneath the comic tone, the actual facts of the story remain consistent within the show. Thelma did go to Mexico City intending to end the pregnancy. Peter was born instead during that visit. He was then smuggled back to Rhode Island rather than staying behind. These are not throwaway jokes invented for a single moment and forgotten. They are treated as real, settled facts about how Peter came into the world, referenced as part of his established personal history. Growing up as a child raised by Francis and Thelma in Providence, Peter would have had no reason to suspect that anything about his birth or his family had been anything other than completely ordinary. Children rarely question the basic facts of their own family history unless something specifically prompts them to. For much of his life, as far as the show suggests, Peter simply understood himself to be the son of Francis and Thelma Griffin, raised in the Catholic faith, with nothing unusual standing out about where he had come from.
That basic understanding of himself, however, would eventually be challenged in a much bigger and more direct way than the quiet, rarely discussed story of his birth in Mexico City. That bigger challenge came in an episode called Peter's Two Dads. Within this episode, Peter discovers something that reshapes how he understands his own identity. He learns that Francis Griffin, the man who raised him and whom he had always understood to be his father, was not actually his biological father at all. His real biological father, the man whose blood he actually shared, was a different man entirely, an Irish immigrant named Mickey McFinnigan. This kind of discovery, learning as an adult that the man who raised you is not your biological parent, is the sort of revelation that could completely upend a person's sense of who they are and where they come from. For Peter, it meant that a piece of his identity he had never questioned before, his family, his bloodline, his sense of where his personality and his roots actually came from, suddenly needed to be reconsidered entirely. Rather than simply learning this fact and moving on, Peter chose to act on it. He traveled to find Mickey McFinnigan and meet him in person, a moment that carried real weight given what this meeting represented. This was not a casual visit between old acquaintances. It was a grown man meeting for the first time in his adult life the biological father he had never known existed until that point. The meeting did not go smoothly at first. When Peter first found Mickey rejected him. Whatever reasons lay behind that initial rejection, the show establishes clearly that this first encounter between father and son did not begin with open arms or an easy reunion. Instead, it began with Mickey turning Peter away.
What eventually changed that outcome was not a long conversation or an emotional breakthrough in the way many other stories might resolve a moment like this. Instead, acceptance came through something far more in keeping with the personality already established for Mickey, and, in many ways, for Peter himself. Mickey eventually accepted Peter as his son only after Peter beat him in what the show refers to as the game of drink. This game involves two people matching shots of alcohol with each other, drink for drink, until one of the two people involved passes out from how much they have consumed. Peter won this contest against Mickey, and it was specifically that victory, earning respect through outlasting his own biological father in a drinking match, that finally led Mickey to accept him as his son. There is something worth noticing in how closely this method of acceptance fits with the personality traits already built into both Peter and the world he inhabits. This is not a show that tends to resolve father and son reunions through quiet, gentle conversations filled with careful emotional language. It resolves them through a loud, physical, almost absurd contest, one built around drinking rather than talking. And it treats that contest as a completely legitimate and meaningful way for a father and son to finally connect. In its own strange way, this fits perfectly with everything the show has already established about the world Peter comes from. A world built on blunt honesty, physical comedy, and characters who tend to express themselves through action rather than careful, measured words. The character of Mickey McFinnigan did not come from nowhere creatively either. Seth MacFarlane has explained that Mickey was based on friends of his own father, specifically the kind of men MacFarlane remembered from his own childhood. Growing up, MacFarlane's father had a circle of friends who were big, loud, opinionated men from New England, many of them Irish Catholic, each one bursting with personality in their own distinct way. MacFarlane has said directly that Family Guy as a whole grew out of years spent observing exactly this kind of person, archetypes he had watched closely for a long time before ever putting pen to paper to create the world of this show. Mickey, then, is not simply a random plot device invented to explain where Peter's biological family came from. He is another example of MacFarlane pulling directly from real people he had known and observed throughout his own life. The same creative approach that had already shaped Peter's voice through the memory of a college security guard, and that had shaped the earliest version of the entire Griffin family through MacFarlane's own college thesis film. This reveal about Mickey McFinnigan also stands in an interesting relationship to an earlier storyline the show had explored before this particular episode ever aired. Prior to the discovery of Peter's true biological father, earlier episodes of the show had implied something different about Peter's ancestry. Specifically, it had been implied that Peter had a black ancestor named Nate Griffin, a man Peter discovered had once been a slave owned by the ancestors of his wife, Lois. This earlier storyline suggested an entirely different kind of family history than the one eventually settled by the Mickey McFinnigan reveal, one rooted in the deep and painful history of slavery in America, rather than in a simple, drunken reunion between a father and the son he never knew he had.
The fact that these two different pieces of backstory exist within the show, one suggesting an ancestor connected to slavery, the other later establishing an entirely different biological father discovered as an adult, says something honest about how long-running animated comedies sometimes handle continuity. Shows that run for decades and produce hundreds of episodes, written by many different writers across many different years, do not always keep every single detail perfectly consistent from one storyline to the next. Earlier ideas sometimes get set aside or quietly replaced by newer ones as the show continues to grow and change direction over time. Both of these pieces of backstory exist somewhere within the history of the show, even though they point toward very different explanations of where Peter's roots actually come from. Taken together, everything the show has revealed about Peter's background paints a picture of a character whose origins are far stranger and more complicated than his loud, simple, easygoing personality might initially suggest. He was raised by a couple in the Catholic faith, believing them to be his biological parents for most of his life. His actual birth involved a trip to Mexico City that was never supposed to end with a living child at all. And his real biological father turned out to be a completely different man, an Irish immigrant he had to track down and, in his own unusual way, earned the respect of before being fully accepted as his son. None of these details are the kind of thing Peter brings up regularly in casual conversation with his friends at the bar. They exist mostly in the background of the show, referenced occasionally rather than constantly, yet they remain part of the established history of who this character actually is underneath the surface. It says something about the show itself that this much complicated, unusual backstory could exist behind a character who spends most of his time on screen doing nothing more dramatic than sitting on his couch, arguing with his neighbors, or getting into some new ridiculous scheme with his friends. Peter Griffin, on the surface, is often treated as a simple character, defined mostly by his loud voice, his lack of self-control, and his tendency to say whatever thought happens to cross his mind in any given moment. Yet underneath that surface sits a family history involving a mother who once intended to end her pregnancy in another country, a father who was not his real father at all, and a biological father who only accepted him after losing a drinking contest. This gap between how simple Peter appears on the surface and how strange his actual history turns out to be is part of what has allowed the show to keep returning to his backstory across so many different seasons, always finding new, small pieces to reveal without ever needing to fully explain or resolve every detail all at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By this point, the show had spent real time building out who Peter Griffin actually was, both in terms of where his voice and appearance had come from, and in terms of the tangled, unusual family history sitting quietly behind him. Audiences understood him as a father, a husband, and a fully formed character with real roots stretching back through his own strange personal history. Yet all of this careful character building happened during a period when the show itself was facing a very real threat to its own survival. The very network that had given Peter Griffin a home on national television was, before long, about to take that home away entirely. Section 5. 2 cancellations. A television show reaching air for the first time is only ever the start of its story. Getting a series onto a network schedule proves that executives believed in an idea enough to spend real money bringing it to life. It does not prove that regular people sitting at home, flipping through channels on any given night, will actually choose to watch it, and watch it again the following week, and the week after that. Family Guy had cleared the first hurdle by making it to air on January 31st, 1999. What came next would test whether the show could survive long enough to become anything more than a short-lived experiment that Fox had once taken a chance on. Television networks measure success mostly through a single tool, and that tool is ratings. Ratings are simply a way of counting how many people are watching a show at any given moment, broken down by different groups such as total viewers or viewers within a certain age range that advertisers care most about reaching. A network does not keep a show on the air out of loyalty or personal affection for the characters. A show stays on the air because enough people are watching it, because those viewers make the show valuable to advertisers, and because that value, in turn, makes the show worth the cost of continuing to produce it. When ratings fall low enough, a network faces a hard decision, one that has nothing to do with whether the writers, animators, and actors involved still believe in what they are making. In its earliest days, Family Guy found itself placed in a strong position on the schedule. Its first season aired following major sporting events, and in a time slot that gave it real visibility, a placement designed to give a brand new, unproven series the best possible chance to find an audience. This kind of favorable scheduling reflected genuine confidence from Fox in what MacFarlane and his team had built, the same confidence that had led the network to commission 13 episodes in the first place after watching his home-built pilot. Season 1 earned solid attention in this strong slot, giving early signs that the show had connected with at least a meaningful portion of viewers. Yet a single strong season, especially a short first season, is rarely enough on its own to guarantee a show a long and stable future. Networks constantly shift and rearrange their schedules from year to year, moving shows around based on a wide mix of factors, including what other programs are airing at the same time on competing channels, what kind of audience a network hopes to attract during a particular night, and how much continued faith the network still has in a given series compared to newer shows waiting for their own chance at a time slot. For its second season, Family Guy was moved to Thursday nights. This single scheduling change turned out to matter enormously. Thursday night, during this period of television history, was one of the most competitive nights on the entire broadcast calendar, filled with some of the strongest, most heavily watched programs on television. Placed in this new slot, Family Guy found itself airing directly opposite Frasier, an established and highly respected comedy series that already had a large, loyal audience built up over several prior seasons. Going up against a strong, well-known competitor like this made it far harder for a still growing, still relatively new show to hold on to viewers, let alone continue expanding its audience the way it had during its more favorable first season placement. The result of this tougher competition showed up clearly in the ratings numbers. Viewership for Family Guy declined during this period, a drop that came at exactly the wrong time for a show that had not yet built up the kind of long-term audience loyalty needed to survive a difficult scheduling situation. Fox, watching these declining numbers, made a decision that many newer, still fragile shows have faced throughout television history. In the year 2000, following the end of season 2, Fox canceled Family Guy. For a show that had only just finished its second season, this was a serious blow. Cancellation after only 2 seasons meant the show would end having produced a relatively small number of episodes, nowhere near enough to build the kind of large, lasting library that keeps a series alive in reruns and cultural memory for decades afterward. Had this first cancellation been the final word on Family Guy, the show would likely be remembered today, if remembered at all, as a short-lived, mildly interesting animated comedy that came and went quickly during the late 1990s and early 2000s, one of countless shows that networks try, cancel, and move past within just a couple of years. That did not end up being how the story played out, at least not yet. Despite the initial decision to cancel the show after its second season, Family Guy received a reprieve. A reprieve, in this context, means that a decision to end something is reversed or delayed, giving whatever was facing cancellation another chance to continue rather than ending immediately as originally planned. Fox, for reasons tied to its own internal scheduling needs and programming decisions at the time, chose to bring Family Guy back for a third season rather than letting the cancellation stand as final. This reprieve gave the show a second life, but it did not erase the difficult reality the series was still facing. Being saved from cancellation once does not guarantee a show any long-term security going forward. It simply means the clock has been reset, with the same basic pressures, ratings, competition, and network patience still very much in play. Family Guy's third season would need to prove itself all over again, this time carrying the added weight of already having been canceled once before. Season 3 of Family Guy premiered in July of 2001. Once again, scheduling played a defining role in how this next chapter of the show's story would unfold. This time, the show was placed in an even more difficult position than it had faced during its second season. It was scheduled for Thursdays at 8 in the evening, a time slot that placed it directly opposite 2 of the most dominant programs on all of television at that particular moment. The first of these 2 major competitors was Friends, one of the most watched and most culturally significant sitcoms in the history of American television. During this period, Friends was airing as the single most watched show of the entire television season across the country. Going up against a program with that level of dominance would have been an extremely difficult challenge for almost any show on the schedule, let alone one still working to establish itself with a broad national audience. As if competing directly against the most watched show in the country were not difficult enough on its own, Family Guy also found itself airing at the same time as Survivor, the breakout reality competition series that had exploded in popularity around this same period. Survivor represented something genuinely new in television at the time, a completely fresh style of programming that captured enormous public attention and drew huge numbers of viewers eager to see who would be voted off the island each week. Between Friends drawing one massive segment of the national audience and Survivor pulling in another, Family Guy was left fighting for whatever viewers remained once these 2 powerhouse programs had already claimed the largest shares of the audience for that specific hour.
hour. The impact of this scheduling decision showed up quickly and sharply in the ratings. Family Guy suffered an even steeper decline in viewership during this period than it had experienced during its difficult second season. Being placed opposite Frasier had already proven challenging enough to contribute to the show's first cancellation. Being placed opposite both Friends and Survivor at the same time created a far more severe drop, one that left the show with a noticeably smaller audience than it needed to remain a stable, secure part of Fox's lineup. Faced with these steep ratings declines, Fox made the decision to cancel Family Guy for a second time. This cancellation was announced shortly after the third season had finished airing in 2002. Unlike the first cancellation, which had been reversed before it ever became truly final, this second cancellation stuck. There would be no quick reprieve this time, no last-minute decision to bring the show back for a fourth season the way there had been after season 2. As far as Fox was concerned in that moment, Family Guy's run on television had come to an end. This second cancellation carried a strange and somewhat unusual detail with it.
Season 3 had produced a certain number of completed episodes, but not every single one of them had actually made it to air before the cancellation took effect. One finished episode remained unaired at the time the show officially ended its run. Officially, the show's original run came to a close on February 14th, 2002, having produced 21 episodes as part of its third season up to that point. The remaining completed episodes simply sat unused, a finished piece of work with nowhere left to air, since the show it belonged to no longer had a home on network television. There is something worth sitting with in this detail. An entire episode, fully written, fully animated, fully voiced and completed by the cast and crew, existed and was ready to be shown to audiences, yet had no place to go once the cancellation took hold. It represented finished work from a show that, as far as anyone knew at that exact moment in 2002, no longer had any future ahead of it. That single unaired episode would remain in limbo for some time afterward, a small, unresolved leftover piece of a show that appeared to have reached its true and final ending. Looking back at this period, it is easy to see just how much the fate of a television show can rest on decisions that have very little to do with the actual quality of the writing, the characters, or the humor itself. Family Guy did not lose its audience because the show suddenly became less funny or less well made during its second and third seasons. It lost audience share because it was placed, twice in a row, directly opposite some of the most dominant programming in the history of American television. A show airing in a quieter, less competitive time slot might have held on to a stable, steady audience, even with the exact same episodes and the exact same jokes. Timing and scheduling, factors entirely outside the control of the writers and animators actually building the show week to week, played an enormous role in pushing Family Guy toward cancellation not once, but twice within just a few short years. For everyone who had worked on the show up to this point, this must have felt like a genuinely uncertain and difficult moment. Seth MacFarlane had spent years building toward this show, starting all the way back with a college thesis film, carrying that idea through a career at a major cartoon studio, pitching a hand-animated presentation out of his own home, and finally, watching Fox commission a full series based on characters he had first sketched years earlier. Now, after only 3 seasons and a total cancellation that had actually happened twice, that same show appeared to have reached a permanent end. The Griffin family, introduced to the world with real excitement back in January of 1999, seemed destined to become nothing more than a short 3-season chapter in television history, remembered by only a relatively small number of early viewers who had happened to catch it during its original, difficult run on Fox. Nothing about this moment suggested that Peter Griffin and his family were about to become one of the most recognized and long-running groups of characters in the history of American television. If anything, the opposite seemed true. A show canceled twice within its first 3 seasons, forced to fight for survival against some of the strongest competition network television had to offer, looked far more likely to fade quietly into obscurity than to eventually run for decades and produce hundreds of episodes. Based purely on what had happened up to this point, there was no clear reason to expect that Family Guy would ever return to television at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Yet the story did not end here, even though it certainly could have. Somewhere between the moment Fox let this second cancellation stand as final and whatever came next, something unexpected began to shift the fate of this show in a completely different direction. It would not come from Fox suddenly changing its mind on its own, and it would not come from a dramatic decision made inside a network boardroom. It would come from somewhere else entirely, from the way audiences kept finding this supposedly finished show long after it had already been declared over. Section 6, saved by
reruns and DVDs. When a television show gets canceled, most people assume that is the end of the story. The episodes that already exist might occasionally turn up somewhere on a random channel late at night, but the show itself stops growing. No new episodes get made, no new jokes get written.
The cast stops recording. As far as the outside world is concerned, the story is finished, and everyone involved moves on to whatever comes next in their careers. This is almost always exactly what happens when a network cancels a series. Family Guy had already been canceled once in 2000, saved briefly, and then canceled again in 2002. By every normal measure of how television works, that second cancellation should have been the true and final end of the show. What makes this part of the story worth paying close attention to is that the ending everyone expected never actually arrived. Instead, something highly unusual took place, something that had rarely, if ever, happened in quite this way before. A show that Fox had already declared finished found its way back onto television, not because the network suddenly changed its mind on its own, but because of what happened to the show after it had already been canceled. The path back to life for Family Guy did not run through Fox at all, at least not at first. It ran through a completely different television network, and through a format that most people at the time did not think of as a way to save a canceled show at all. That other network was Cartoon Network, and more specifically, a late-night programming block it aired called Adult Swim. Adult Swim was built around a simple idea. During the daytime and early evening hours, Cartoon Network aired shows made for children, the kind of cartoons most people naturally think of when they hear the word cartoon. But once nighttime arrived, the channel would shift into a completely different mode, airing animated shows aimed specifically at older teenagers and adults instead. This late-night block gave a home to programs with more mature humor, sharper writing, and content that would never have fit comfortably alongside children's programming earlier in the day. Cartoon Network purchased the rights to air reruns of Family Guy, meaning they gained permission to broadcast episodes that had already aired once before on Fox, now airing them again during this late-night Adult Swim block. This kind of deal happens fairly often in television. Once a show has finished its original run somewhere, other networks can sometimes buy the rights to show those same episodes again to a different audience, often for a fairly low cost, since the network buying the reruns is not taking on the risk of producing anything new. For Cartoon Network, picking up reruns of a canceled Fox comedy was a relatively low-risk, low-cost addition to their late-night lineup. Nobody involved could have known for certain, at the moment this deal was made, that it would end up completely changing the future of the show. Family Guy began airing in reruns on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. This date matters because it marks the exact point where the show's fortunes began to shift in a direction nobody had fully expected. Almost immediately, something became clear. The show was not simply filling a quiet, forgettable slot in Cartoon Network's late-night schedule. It quickly became the single top-rated program airing during that entire block. Among everything airing on Adult Swim at that time, episodes that viewers had already had the chance to watch once before, back when the show was still airing new episodes on Fox, were now outperforming everything else on the schedule. The scale of this success becomes clearer with a specific number attached to it. Airing Family Guy on Adult Swim boosted viewership for that late-night block by 239%. A jump of this size is enormous by almost any standard used to measure television success. It meant that when Family Guy was airing, far more people were tuning in to watch than during other parts of the same programming block. This was not a small, gradual increase built up slowly over time. It was a rapid, dramatic surge in interest, arriving specifically because this one canceled show had found its way onto a new channel where a slightly different audience, watching at a slightly different time of night, had the chance to discover it, in many cases for the very first time. It is worth pausing on why this matters so much. A show earning strong ratings while it is still actively airing new episodes on its original network is one thing. Networks expect that kind of performance from a healthy, ongoing series. But a show earning this level of attention through reruns, after it had already been canceled and declared finished, is a completely different situation. It suggests that the interest people were showing was not simply tied to curiosity about brand new episodes or fresh storylines. It was interest in the material that already existed. Episodes that had, in some cases, already aired once before and quietly failed to hold on to a large enough audience during their original Fox broadcast. Somehow, placed in a new setting, in front of a new or renewed audience, on a different night, on a different channel, those same episodes were now drawing enormous attention. At almost exactly the same time that these reruns were taking off on Adult Swim, something else was happening that would end up reinforcing this same pattern even further. The complete first and second seasons of Family Guy were
released together on DVD. And this release happened during the very same week that the show began airing on Adult Swim. This timing was not necessarily planned with perfect precision to work together, but the two events ended up feeding directly into one another. People who caught the show for the first time on Adult Swim, or who remembered enjoying it during its original run on Fox, suddenly had an easy, direct way to own the episodes and watch them again whenever they wanted, rather than depending on catching them by chance on a late-night television schedule. The response to this DVD release was immediate and significant. Within just 1 month of going on sale, the DVD set sold 400,000 copies. A number like that, reached within a single month, signals a level of demand that goes well beyond a small, quiet group of loyal fans. It points toward a much wider audience actively seeking this show out, buying physical copies of episodes for a series that had, according to Fox at least, already reached the end of its story. Sales did not stop after that first strong month. Over time, the DVD set for the first and second seasons went on to sell a total of 2.2 million copies. To put a number like this into perspective, it helps to know how this release compared to other television DVDs being sold around that same period. The Family Guy, Season 1 and 2, set became the best-selling television DVD of 2003, outperforming every other television show DVD released that year. It also became the second best-selling television DVD of all time up to that point, ranking just behind the first season set of Chappelle's Show, another major comedy series that had also become a huge success through similar word-of-mouth and repeated viewing. The success did not end with just the first 2 seasons, either. When the DVD set covering the show's third season was released, it also performed strongly, selling more than 1 million copies on its own. Taken together, these numbers paint a very clear picture. This was not a small, gradual rebuilding of interest happening quietly in the background. This was a large, fast-growing wave of people actively choosing to seek this show out, buy it, and watch it, often more than once, at a moment when the show itself had no new episodes being made and no official presence anywhere on network television. All of this raises a fairly simple question. Why would a show that had already failed to hold on to a large enough audience during its original Fox broadcast suddenly find such a large and enthusiastic audience once it moved to reruns and DVD sales instead? Part of the answer likely comes back to the same scheduling problems discussed earlier. During its original run, Family Guy had been placed opposite some of the most dominant programs on all of television. First Frasier, and later both Friends and Survivor at the same time. Viewers who might have genuinely enjoyed the show never necessarily got the chance to discover it in the first place, simply because they were already busy watching one of those other, more heavily promoted and more widely watched programs during that same hour. Once the show moved to a completely different time slot on a completely different channel, and once viewers gained the ability to buy the DVD sets and watch entire seasons whenever they wanted, rather than being tied to a single weekly broadcast time, many more people finally had the chance to actually sit down and watch it. There is also something worth noting about how a show sometimes benefits from a second chance to build word of mouth. When a series is brand new, most viewers are still deciding whether it is worth their time, often based on very limited information, such as a single episode or a short promotional clip. By the time Family Guy reached Adult Swim and the DVD shelves, it already had 3 completed seasons worth of material behind it, giving new viewers a much larger, more fully developed body of work to judge the show by, rather than just a handful of early episodes still finding their footing. Viewers discovering the show for the first time during this period were not judging it based only on its earliest, most uncertain episodes. They were able to watch a much fuller picture of what the show had actually become by the time its original run ended. Whatever the exact mix of reasons behind it, the pattern quickly became impossible for Fox to ignore. A show the network had canceled, one it had officially declared finished, was now generating extremely strong viewership numbers on a competing channel and breaking DVD sales records at the same time. This created an unusual and rare situation within the television industry. Normally, once a show is canceled and its cast and crew have moved on, that decision tends to stay final. Executives rarely reverse course entirely and bring a show back from the dead once it has already been canceled for a second time. Yet the numbers coming out of the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales were strong enough and consistent enough that they became difficult for Fox to simply set aside and ignore. On May 20th, 2004, Fox made the decision to bring Family Guy back. The network ordered 35 new episodes of the show, officially reversing the cancellation that had been announced back in 2002. This decision carried real significance beyond just the fate of one single television show. It marked the first time in television history that a series had been revived specifically based on the strength of its DVD sales.
Other shows had occasionally returned from cancellation before, sometimes due to strong fan campaigns or unusual scheduling circumstances. But a revival driven specifically by how well a show performed once it was already off the air, purely through DVD purchases and rerun ratings, rather than through its original broadcast, had not happened in quite this way before. Family Guy became the clear example that other networks and other canceled shows would later be compared to whenever a similar situation arose in the years that followed. Bringing a canceled show back to life involves far more than simply announcing that new episodes will be made. An entire production had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Writers who had moved on to other projects after the show's cancellation had to be brought back together. Animation teams had to be reassembled. The voice cast, including Seth MacFarlane himself, had to return to record new material for a show that, only a couple of years earlier, had appeared to be permanently finished. All of this work took real time to organize and complete, which meant that even after Fox placed its order for new episodes in May of 2004, viewers still had to wait a while longer before any of that new material would actually reach their television screens. That wait finally ended on May 1st, 2005. This date marked the premiere of the show's 4th season, and with it, the official return of Family Guy to network television after roughly 3 years without any new episodes at all. The episode that reintroduced the show to its audience was called North by North Quahog, a title that played on the town where the Griffin family lived, Quahog, Rhode Island, the same fictional town that had been established all the way back at the very beginning of the series. This time, Fox took steps to avoid repeating the same scheduling mistakes that had contributed to the show's earlier struggles. Rather than placing Family Guy in another highly competitive slot against major established hits the way it had during its 2nd and 3rd seasons, the network gave the returning show a much safer and more supportive position on the schedule, airing it on Sunday nights following The Simpsons, another long-running animated comedy that already had a large, loyal audience built up over many years. Airing directly after an established hit like The Simpsons gave the newly returned show a strong, built-in audience, made up of viewers who were already tuned in to watch The Simpsons and were likely to keep watching whatever aired right afterward. The response to this new premiere confirmed everything the Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales had already suggested. The premiere episode of Season 4 earned the show's highest ratings since an episode from its very first season titled Brian, Portrait of a Dog. This comparison matters because it shows just how far the show's audience had grown during the years it had spent off the air entirely. A returning show earning ratings that matched or exceeded some of its strongest moments from its original, much more heavily promoted first season was a clear sign that the interest built up through reruns and DVD sales had translated directly into real viewers tuning in once new episodes actually became available again. Looking back at this entire stretch of the show's history, from the second cancellation in 2002 through the premiere of Season 4 in 2005, it becomes clear just how unusual and unlikely this path back to television really was. Most canceled shows never come back at all, regardless of how much any small group of fans might wish they would. The ones that do return usually do so fairly quickly, often within the same year or two, before too much time has passed and before the cast and crew have fully scattered onto other projects. Family Guy spent roughly 3 full years completely off the air, with no new episodes being produced anywhere, before finally returning through a path built almost entirely on reruns, airing on a different network, and DVD sales happening entirely outside of any broadcast schedule at all. This period also reveals something worth remembering about how audiences and networks do not always agree on the value of a show at the exact same moment. Fox, watching ratings numbers during the show's original run, concluded that Family Guy did not have a large enough audience to justify keeping it on the air, not once, but twice. Yet during the very same years, once episodes became available through Adult Swim and through DVD sales, an enormous number of viewers were actively choosing to watch and rewatch the same material on their own terms. The show had not become funnier or better made during this gap. The exact same episodes that had struggled to hold a large enough live audience on Fox were the very same episodes now breaking DVD sales records and dominating a competing network's late-night ratings. What had changed was simply how and when people were given the chance to actually watch it. By the time Season 4 premiered in May of 2005, the Griffin family had done something remarkably rare in the history of American television. They had been canceled, brought back briefly, canceled again, and then, against very long odds, brought back a second time, not through a network's sudden change of heart, but through an audience that kept finding the show and kept choosing to watch it long after Fox itself had already walked away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With the show now safely back on the air and settled into a much stronger, more secure position on Fox's schedule,
individual, Family Guy could finally begin building towards something much larger than survival. What came next would not simply be about staying on television. It would be about the specific kinds of jokes, running gags, and musical numbers that would come to define exactly what kind of show this had truly become, and exactly what made Peter Griffin's particular sense of humor so recognizable to millions of viewers going forward.
Section 7. Peter's signature comedic devices. By the time Family Guy had returned to television in 2005, safely settled into its new Sunday night home following The Simpsons, the show had already spent years figuring out exactly what kind of comedy worked best for this particular family and this particular version of Peter Griffin. Some of that comedy had been present since the very earliest episodes. Some of it grew and expanded once the show came back from cancellation and had more time, more seasons, and more freedom to build out its own particular style. Taken together, a handful of comedic tools became so closely tied to Family Guy that they eventually became part of how people described the show itself, even people who had never sat down and watched a full episode from start to finish. The most well-known of these tools is something the show became famous for almost from its earliest days. In the middle of a normal scene, the story would suddenly stop and cut away to something completely different. A character might mention a memory, a comparison, or a passing thought, and instead of simply describing it in words, the show would jump straight into a short, separate scene showing that memory or thought playing out. Once that short scene finished, often lasting only a few seconds, the show would cut right back to where the main story had left off, usually without any of the characters acknowledging that anything unusual had just happened at all. These short interruptions came to be known as cutaway gags, and they became one of the clearest fingerprints of the show's overall sense of humor. A cutaway gag rarely needs to connect logically to the main plot of an episode. Peter might be having an ordinary conversation with Lois about dinner, and in the middle of that conversation, he could casually mention that this reminds him of the time he worked at a chocolate factory, or the time he tried to return a defective toaster, or some other completely unrelated memory. The show would then cut directly into that memory, playing it out as its own small, self-contained scene, often with its own separate joke or punchline, before snapping back to the kitchen conversation exactly where it had left off. Peter Griffin, more than any other character on the show, became closely associated with this style of humor. In fact, he practically became the face of this specific kind of joke, to the point where longtime viewers and critics writing about the show often use a very specific nickname for one particular type of cutaway that Peter tends to deliver. These are sometimes referred to as manatee jokes, a phrase that has come to describe cutaway gags that reveal small, strange, and often personal facts about Peter that have never come up anywhere else in the show. These jokes tend to work because they arrive with complete confidence, delivered by Peter as though the fact being revealed is simply an ordinary, unremarkable part of who he is, even when the actual content of the joke is completely absurd. A handful of examples make clear exactly how this pattern works. In one of these cutaway gags, it is revealed that Peter was not born a man. In another, viewers learn that he only recently finished the 4th grade, despite already being a fully grown adult with a wife and children of his own. In yet another, the show reveals that even Peter himself does not find the comedy of a specific real-world comedian particularly funny. A small, oddly specific detail delivered with the same flat confidence as everything else revealed through this style of joke. None of these moments are meant to be taken as serious, ongoing facts that shape future episodes. They exist purely within their own short scene, delivered once and then set aside completely as the show moves back into its main story. What makes this particular comedic device work so well with Peter specifically comes back to everything already established about how his character was built in the first place. His voice was shaped by a real security guard McFarlane had known in college, a man who, according to McFarlane, had no filter standing between his thoughts and the words that came out of his mouth. A character built around that specific idea. Someone who says whatever crosses his mind without pausing to consider whether it makes sense or fits the situation is a perfect fit for a joke style built entirely around sudden, unexplained tangents. Peter does not need a strong reason to suddenly bring up an old memory or a strange personal fact. His entire personality, going all the way back to how McFarlane first built the character, already gives him permission to jump into these moments without any real setup at all. Cutaway gags also gave the show a very specific kind of comedic flexibility that most traditional sitcoms do not have. A live-action comedy filmed in a single house or office set often has to work fairly hard to introduce new settings, new side characters, or new small jokes that fall outside the main story. Building an entirely new physical set, hiring new actors for a single scene, and filming that scene all takes real time and
real money.
Animation removes many of those barriers. A cutaway to Peter working in a completely different job, standing in a completely different country, or interacting with a character who will never appear again for the rest of the series costs the show relatively little extra effort compared to what a live-action series would need to spend to pull off the same kind of joke. This gave Family Guy the freedom to constantly introduce brand new, short-lived jokes almost every single episode, building a reputation for humor that rarely stayed in one place for very long before jumping somewhere completely unexpected. Alongside these short cutaway gags, the show also built one of its most recognizable ongoing storylines around a running joke involving Peter and a character known simply as the Giant Chicken. Unlike the quick, one-time nature of a typical cutaway gag, the feud between Peter and this chicken became something the show returned to again and again across many different seasons, always in roughly the same basic shape, even as the specific details of each individual fight changed from one appearance to the next. The origin of this feud, according to the show itself, traces back to something almost comically small. The entire conflict between Peter and the Giant Chicken began with a dispute over an expired coupon. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it highlights exactly the kind of humor Family Guy tends to build its biggest, most elaborate jokes around. A disagreement over a piece of paper that no longer holds any real value, the kind of minor annoyance most people would simply shrug off and forget within a few minutes, becomes, within the world of this show, the spark for what grows into one of the most exaggerated and destructive running gags across the entire series. Once this feud begins, the show does not treat it as a small, one-time argument that gets resolved quickly. Instead, the fights between Peter and the Giant Chicken escalate significantly every time they reappear. What starts as a disagreement over an expired coupon eventually grows into massive, prolonged physical battles between the two of them, often stretching on for several minutes at a time within a single episode, far longer than almost any other single joke or scene the show typically commits to. These fights involve exaggerated, over-the-top physical comedy, with Peter and the chicken crashing through walls, destroying entire buildings, and causing enormous amounts of damage to the world around them, all stemming from a conflict that began over something as minor as an outdated coupon. The joke here works on more than one level at once. On the surface, there is simple physical comedy in watching two characters throw each other through storefronts and demolish entire city blocks in an exaggerated fight. But underneath that surface sits a second layer of humor built entirely around the gap between how small the original disagreement was and how enormous the resulting fights have become. A show willing to dedicate several full minutes of screen time to an increasingly destructive battle that technically began over an expired coupon is making a very specific kind of joke about how disproportionate real human conflicts can sometimes become. Even if the show itself rarely stops to explain that idea directly, it simply lets the size of the fights speak for themselves, escalating a little further nearly every time the chicken reappears. This running feud also gave the show a reliable tool it could return to across many different seasons without it ever feeling repetitive in exactly the same way each time. Because the specific location, the specific damage caused, and the specific way each individual fight unfolds tend to shift from one appearance to the next, longtime viewers could recognize the basic shape of the joke: two characters engaged in an absurdly long and destructive fight rooted in a trivial disagreement, while still being surprised by the specific details of how any individual fight plays out. Few other running jokes on the show carry quite this same level of built-in escalation, making the feud between Peter and the Giant Chicken one of the most immediately recognizable elements of the entire series, even to people who may not remember many other specific details about the show. Beyond cutaway gags and the ongoing chicken feud, Family Guy also built a strong identity around another kind of comedy entirely, one built around music. Throughout its run, the show has featured elaborate musical numbers, often built around detailed choreography and full musical arrangements, closer in style and ambition to something a viewer might expect from a stage musical than from a typical half-hour animated sitcom. These sequences take real production effort to put together, requiring original music, coordinated movement between multiple animated characters, and careful timing between the visuals and the songs themselves. What makes these musical numbers especially notable is not simply that they exist, but the specific subjects the show has chosen to address through them. Rather than reserving musical sequences purely for light, silly, low-stakes jokes, Family Guy has used this format to tackle genuinely serious and often uncomfortable real-world topics. Musical numbers throughout the show's run have addressed subjects such as AIDS, teenage pregnancy, and the legalization of marijuana, taking issues that many other comedies might handle carefully and cautiously, if
if they choose to address them at all, and instead building full musical sequences around them. This choice reflects something important about how Family Guy generally approaches difficult subject matter. Rather than avoiding serious topics entirely, or treating them with the kind of careful, delicate tone many other shows might reach for, Family Guy tends to push directly into uncomfortable territory, often using exaggerated comedy, catchy music, and confident performances to address subjects that might otherwise feel heavy or difficult to sit through. Whether or not any individual viewer finds this approach effective, appropriate, or funny is a matter of personal taste that has shaped a great deal of the ongoing conversation and disagreement around the show over the years.
What remains true, regardless of personal opinion, is that these musical sequences represent a consistent, deliberate choice by the show to use one of its most polished, carefully produced comedic tools, specifically on subjects most sitcoms would treat far more cautiously. The show's musical ambitions were not limited only to short, individual song sequences scattered within regular episodes. Family Guy also produced a set of 3 feature-length specials built entirely around a single, massive parody project, retelling the story of the original Star Wars film trilogy using its own cast of characters, standing in for the roles originally played by well-known actors in the films. These 3 specials were released one at a time over several years, rather than all together at once. The first, called Blue Harvest, arrived in 2007. The second, titled Something 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 Dark Side, followed in 2009. The third and final special in this set, called It Is a Trap, was released in 2010. Each of these specials was later released on DVD, giving audiences a way to own and rewatch these longer, more ambitious projects outside of their original television broadcasts. Producing 3 separate feature-length specials, each one closely following the plot of an entire Star Wars film, while filling every role with a Family Guy character, represents a significant undertaking, well beyond the scope of a typical single episode. This kind of large-scale parody project requires far more planning, animation work, and creative coordination than a standard half-hour episode built around several separate storylines and a handful of cutaway gags. The willingness to commit this much time and effort to a single connected project across multiple years shows how seriously the show's creative team treated the idea of parody and homage as a central part of what Family Guy was trying to do, not just through quick jokes, but through entire dedicated specials built around honoring and poking fun at a specific piece of major pop culture history. Even outside of cutaway gags, the chicken feud, musical numbers, and the Star Wars specials, the show developed other, smaller running patterns that longtime viewers came to recognize and expect. One example involves Peter's close friend and neighbor Cleveland Brown, who frequently experiences sudden, catastrophic accidents involving his own home. In particular, a recurring joke shows Cleveland's house, or sometimes specifically his bathtub, suddenly and unexpectedly giving way while he is inside it, sending him falling with a distinct, startled shout that has become instantly recognizable to fans of the show. This specific reaction, Cleveland's surprised yell as he suddenly drops through his own home, became such a familiar and widely repeated moment that it stands on its own as one of the show's most easily recognized comedic tropes, separate from any of the larger, more elaborate jokes built around Peter himself. Taken all together, these different comedic tools, the sudden unrelated cutaway gags, the increasingly destructive fights with the giant chicken, the elaborate musical numbers tackling serious real-world subjects, the ambitious full-length Star Wars parody specials, and smaller recurring gags involving supporting characters like Cleveland, reveal a show willing to constantly experiment with very different styles of comedy within the same 20-some minutes of any given episode. A single episode might move from a quiet family conversation into a completely unrelated cutaway gag lasting only a few seconds, into a serious musical number addressing a real social issue, and then into an exaggerated physical fight scene, all without ever settling into just one single comedic rhythm for very long. This constant shifting between different types of jokes became part of what made the show feel distinct from many of the other adult animated comedies airing around the same time. Rather than relying on just one dependable formula, repeated carefully episode after episode, Family Guy built its identity around variety itself, constantly interrupting its own main storylines with short tangents, escalating a small, ridiculous feud into massive destructive battles, and occasionally slowing down entirely to deliver a full musical number on a subject far more serious than anything else happening in that same episode. Peter Griffin sits at the center of much of this variety, whether he is the one delivering an absurd, confidently stated cutaway fact about himself, throwing punches at a giant chicken over an expired coupon, or leading an entire cast through a carefully choreographed song about
about a difficult, real-world topic. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of these comedic tools, however, existed purely in a bubble, untouched by any real-world consequences. Making bold, unexpected jokes about real people, real songs, and real public figures. The same kind of material that gave the show so much of its unpredictable energy would eventually lead to serious legal challenges from people and companies who did not appreciate finding themselves or their work turned into material for one of Peter Griffin's jokes. Section 8. The lawsuits Peter's jokes provoked. Making jokes about real people carries a certain amount of risk, even for a cartoon. When a television show pokes fun at someone who actually exists, whether that person is a celebrity, a musician, or the owner of a piece of music or a character created decades earlier, there is always a chance that the person or company being joked about will not find it funny at all. Family Guy, built from the very beginning around a willingness to joke about almost anything, eventually ran directly into this exact problem. Not once, but several times. Over the course of a handful of years, the show found itself facing real legal action from real people who believed their work, their likeness, or their reputation had been used without permission and without any right to do so. Before getting into the specific cases themselves, it helps to understand a basic idea that runs through all of them, something called parody. Parody is a form of comedy where a person or a company takes something that already exists, a song, a character, a public figure, or a well-known piece of work, and creates a new, exaggerated, or mocking version of it for the purpose of making a joke or a point. Parody has a long history in comedy, going back long before television even existed, and courts in the United States have generally recognized that a certain amount of parody is protected under the First Amendment, the part of the United States Constitution that protects freedom of speech. This protection exists because comedy, satire, and criticism often depend on being able to reference and reshape real things in the world. Without some legal room to do that, entire forms of comedy would become nearly impossible to create without constant fear of being sued. At the same time, this protection is not unlimited. Just because something is labeled a joke or a parody does not automatically mean the law will treat it as fully protected. Courts have to weigh a number of factors when someone brings a lawsuit claiming that a parody went too far, including how much of the original work was copied, whether the new version actually comments on or pokes fun at the original in some way, and whether the joke damages the reputation or business interests of the person or company being parodied. This is exactly the kind of legal territory Family Guy found itself standing in on more than one occasion. The first of these major legal disputes involved a well-known entertainer named Carol Burnett. Burnett had built an enormous and respected career in American television, most famously through her own long-running program called The Carol Burnett Show, which aired for 11 seasons between 1967 and 1978. Over the course of that long run, Burnett and her fellow cast members created a large number of memorable characters and sketches that became deeply familiar to television audiences across the country. Her show and its performers went on to win a large number of major television awards over the years, cementing Burnett's place as one of the most respected names in the history of American comedy. One of the most famous characters Burnett created during this run was known as the Charwoman. This character was a cleaning woman, dressed in a simple, recognizable outfit, who appeared in various sketches throughout the show's history. The character became so closely tied to Burnett's public identity that her costume for the role was eventually placed in the Smithsonian, a major national museum system in the United States dedicated to preserving important pieces of American history and culture. Having a costume from a role placed there says a great deal about how significant this character had become within the wider history of American television. On April 23, 2006, Fox aired an episode of Family Guy titled Peterotica. Within this episode, Peter and several of his friends visit a store selling adult material. At one point during the scene, Peter expresses some surprise that the store appears cleaner than he expected it to be. One of his friends explains this by saying that Carol Burnett works part-time as a janitor at the store. The scene then briefly shifts to show an animated version of Burnett's Charwoman character, dressed in her familiar outfit, mopping the floor of the store, surrounded by other adult material visible in the background. As this brief scene plays out, a version of the music originally associated with the Carol Burnett show can be heard in the background, altered slightly from the original. The scene also included a joke referencing a specific, well-known habit of Burnett's from her original show. At the end of each episode of the Carol Burnett show, Burnett would tug on her own ear as a way of sending a quiet, personal message to her grandmother who had raised her. This small gesture became one of the most recognizable and beloved parts of her original program, a genuine, heartfelt moment tucked into the closing of each episode. episode. In the Family Guy scene, this same gesture was referenced through a crude joke suggesting a very different, disrespectful meaning behind the gesture, one that had nothing to do with the warm, personal tribute Burnett had originally intended. Burnett did not take legal action immediately after this episode aired. Nearly a full year passed before she made the decision to move forward with a lawsuit. In March of 2007, Burnett filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox Film Corporation, seeking $2 million. Her legal complaint raised several different claims at once. She argued that the episode violated her copyright by using a character she had created without her permission. She also argued that the episode violated her right of publicity, a legal idea that protects a person's right to control how their own name, image, and likeness are used, especially for purposes they did not agree to. In addition, her complaint raised concerns under a federal law known as the Lanham Act, which deals with issues such as false endorsement and included a claim of common law misappropriation, a broader legal idea covering the improper use of someone's identity. Fox responded to this lawsuit by defending the episode as a legitimate parody. In a public statement responding to the lawsuit, the studio noted that Family Guy, much like the Carol Burnett show itself, had built much of its reputation around parody and satire aimed at pop culture and public figures. The studio expressed surprise that Burnett, someone who had spent much of her own career creating comedy that spoofed other public figures and cultural moments, would choose to sue over a similar kind of joke being made about her. This case moved through the court system for over a year before reaching a final decision. In June of 2007, United States District Judge Dean D. Pregerson ruled on the matter, ultimately dismissing Burnett's case against Fox. The judge based this decision heavily on First Amendment protections for parody, explaining that the ability to create parody and to make crude jokes about public figures is a protected form of speech under the Constitution. As part of the ruling, the judge specifically noted that public figures such as Burnett are frequently the target of parody and pointed comedy in modern media, and observed that creating a memorable character like the Charwoman in the first place had required far more original creative work than simply placing that same character into a crude, comedic scene on another show. With this ruling, Burnett's lawsuit came to an end, without any payment or settlement being made to her. Family Guy continued airing the Peterotica episode exactly as it had originally been broadcast, with no changes made in response to the legal challenge. In the years since, Burnett has been open about the fact that this legal battle, despite being unsuccessful, ended without doing any lasting damage to either her own reputation or the reputation of Family Guy, with both continuing to hold a significant and respected place within the broader history of American television comedy. This first major lawsuit was far from the only legal challenge Family Guy would face during this same general period. Only a matter of months after the Burnett case had worked its way through the courts, the show found itself facing an entirely separate legal dispute, this time centered not on a person, but on a piece of music. On October 3rd, 2007, a company called Bourne Company Music Publishers filed a lawsuit against Family Guy. Bourne Company held the rights to a well-known song called When You Wish Upon a Star, a piece of music with deep roots in American entertainment history, closely associated for decades with Walt Disney and widely recognized by generations of audiences. The lawsuit centered on an episode of Family Guy titled When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. Within this episode, Peter Griffin performs a song called I Need a Jew, a version of the melody that borrows heavily from the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star, while replacing the original lyrics with new comedic ones. One example lyric from the parody song describes a group of people as being widely looked down upon, yet still deeply admired by the person singing about them. Bourne Company argued that this song crossed a clear legal line, separate from the kind of protection that had shielded Family Guy in the earlier Carol Burnett case. Their argument focused on the idea that parody law would not fully apply here, since the Family Guy episode never actually stated out loud that the song was meant to be a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, nor did it directly reference the specific title of the original song within the episode itself. According to this argument, if a parody does not clearly announce or reference what it is making fun of, it may not receive the same level of legal protection that a more obvious, direct parody would normally receive. This case took a significant amount of time to fully resolve, moving through the court system for roughly a year and a half before reaching a final decision. In the end, a United States District Judge ruled in favor of Family Guy, concluding that the show had not violated Bourne Company's copyright, even with the altered lyrics set to a very similar sounding melody. This decision meant that Family Guy did not need to pay any damages related to this particular episode, and the show was permitted to continue airing it without any required changes. Just a short time after this second legal dispute reached its resolution, a third and separate legal challenge arrived, this time connected to a different piece of Family Guy material entirely. This dispute centered on content that appeared not in a regular weekly episode, but in a direct-to-DVD release titled Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story. Within this particular release, a scene depicted a version of Jesus Christ performing a comedic routine that involved a specific set of exaggerated hand gestures paired with a short, repeated humming sound. A comedian named Art Matrano believed that this scene closely copied a routine he had personally created and performed earlier in his own career, one built around a very similar combination of exaggerated hand movements paired with a distinctive vocal sound.
Matrano filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox seeking $2 million, arguing that the Family Guy scene had taken his original comedic material without his permission and without giving him any credit or compensation for it. This particular legal dispute did not follow a simple, straight path toward resolution. At one point, Matrano chose to withdraw his lawsuit in March of 2008, apparently after reaching some kind of understanding directly with 20th Century Fox outside of the courtroom. However, this initial resolution did not turn out to be permanent. In September of 2008, Matrano refiled the same $2 million lawsuit, indicating that whatever earlier agreement had been reached was either not honored or had broken down in some way. As part of his renewed legal effort, Matrano also attempted to formally register his original routine with the United States Copyright Office, seeking official legal recognition that this specific comedic routine belonged to him. The Copyright Office denied his request, a decision that added another layer of complexity to his ongoing legal case against Fox. Despite this setback, Matrano's lawsuit continued to move forward through the court system. In July of 2009, a court rejected a motion from Fox that had asked for the entire case to be dismissed before trial, a decision suggesting that the court believed there was enough of a legitimate legal question here to allow the case to continue rather than ending it early. Rather than proceeding all the way to a full trial, the two sides eventually reached a resolution on their own. In 2010, the case was settled out of court, meaning that Fox and Matrano came to some kind of private agreement to resolve the dispute without a judge or jury issuing a final ruling. The exact amount of money involved in this settlement, if any changed hands at all, was never publicly disclosed. Looking at these three separate legal disputes together, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Each case involved Family Guy taking something that already existed in the real world, whether a beloved television character, a widely known piece of music, or a specific comedic performance style, and reshaping it into new material for one of its own jokes. In two of these three cases, the courts sided firmly with Family Guy, ruling that the use in question fell within the legal protections given to parody and satire under United States law. In the third case, involving Art Matrano, the dispute never reached a final court ruling at all, instead ending through a private settlement between the two parties. These legal battles also reveal something important about how the show approached its own comedy during this particular period of its run. Family Guy was not simply making jokes about broad, general ideas or fully fictional situations invented entirely by its own writers. It was regularly reaching directly into real, specific, and often well-protected pieces of American pop culture history, from a beloved television personality's signature character to a globally recognized piece of music tied closely to one of the largest entertainment companies in the world, to the personal material of an individual working comedian. Each of these choices carried real legal risk that eventually turned into actual courtroom battles, requiring real time, real legal fees, and real uncertainty for the show and the studio behind it. It is also worth noting that these were not the only legal questions the show would face over the course of its long run. Making bold, direct references to real culture, real people, and real works became such a consistent part of how Family Guy operated that legal disputes of this general kind became something the show and its studio had to be prepared to handle as an ongoing part of doing business, rather than as a single unusual event that happened once and never came up again. Taken as a whole, this period shows a show willing to take real risks in pursuit of its own particular brand of humor, risks that occasionally led directly into a courtroom rather than staying safely contained within the world of the show itself. The willingness to push this far into real-world references, even when it meant facing lawsuits from a respected entertainer, a major music rights holder, and an individual comedian, says something about how committed the people behind Family Guy were to building their jokes around instantly recognizable pieces of the real world, rather than staying within the safer boundaries of fully invented, entirely fictional material. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of these legal disputes, however, tell the full story of how audiences and critics actually felt about the show and about Peter Griffin as its central character. Winning a lawsuit in court is a very different thing from winning over public opinion, and as the show continued running season after season, the way people talked about Peter and the humor built around him would begin to shift in ways that had nothing to do with any courtroom at all.
Section 9. From beloved to divisive. A television character does not stay frozen in place the moment a show first airs. As a series grows longer, runs for more seasons, and produces more episodes, the way audiences and critics talk about its main characters can shift a great deal, sometimes in ways nobody involved with the show could have predicted at the very beginning. Peter Griffin is a clear example of exactly this kind of shift. The way people described him in the earliest years of the show looks noticeably different from the way many people describe him after so many additional years and so many additional episodes. When Family Guy first began airing, and especially once it returned to television following its cancellation and its unlikely revival through reruns and DVD sales, Peter Griffin was widely praised by critics for a specific set of qualities. He was seen as a character built around outrageous humor, someone whose jokes and behavior went far beyond what a typical television father would ever say or do. He was known for absurd anecdotes, the kind of strange, out-of-nowhere stories he would casually bring up in conversation, often through the cutaway gags already covered earlier in this story. He was praised for his slapstick antics, meaning the loud, physical, often clumsy kind of comedy, where a character stumbles, crashes, or gets hurt in an exaggerated, cartoonish way that is meant to be funny rather than genuinely painful to watch. And underneath all of that noise and chaos, critics also described him as having an over-the-top, goofy, yet endearing personality, meaning that even with everything ridiculous about him, there was still something likable and warm sitting underneath the surface. This combination of traits gave Peter a very specific identity in the earliest years of the show. He was loud, he was foolish, he said things no responsible adult should probably say out loud, and yet audiences and critics alike still found a way to like him anyway. This is a difficult balance for any comedic character to strike. A character who is simply mean or unpleasant, with nothing warm or likable underneath, tends to become exhausting to watch over time. A character who is too soft or too careful, on the other hand, tends to lose the sharp, unpredictable energy that made the humor interesting in the first place. In its early years, Family Guy managed to keep Peter balanced somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, giving him enough outrageous behavior to keep the jokes surprising, while still keeping enough warmth and clumsy charm underneath to keep audiences rooting for him, rather than simply being put off by him. Over time, however, this balance began to shift, at least according to a large and growing number of critics writing about the show. As the series continued, season after season, reaching a length far beyond what most television comedies ever manage, the specific description used to talk about Peter began to change as well. Reception toward him grew more mixed, meaning that opinions became far more divided than they had been in the show's earlier years. Rather than the earlier language of goofy and endearing, criticism increasingly used very different words to describe him, specifically calling his behavior increasingly crude, mean-spirited, and offensive. The difference between these two sets of words matters a great deal. Crude, mean-spirited, and offensive point towards something sharper and more uncomfortable than the earlier language of outrageous and goofy ever suggested. A character can be outrageous and still be lovable, the way a small child might do something wildly inappropriate without any real understanding of why it might hurt someone. But a character described as mean-spirited is being accused of something different, a kind of behavior that seems to come from a colder, harsher place, even if that behavior is still being played for laughs rather than as a serious moment. This shift in language reflects a real change in how a meaningful portion of critics and viewers came to see Peter as the show continued running for so many years. Part of understanding why this shift happened requires thinking carefully about how long Family Guy has actually been on the air. Very few television shows run for more than 2 decades. A show that manages to stay on air for that long produces an enormous number of episodes, far more than almost any other kind of storytelling format typically attempts. Writing hundreds of episodes about the same core group of characters creates a very real, practical challenge. The writers have to keep finding new jokes, new situations, and new ways to use Peter's personality that still feel fresh, even after using that same basic personality hundreds of times before. One natural pressure that tends to appear in long-running comedies facing this challenge is a pull toward pushing further, saying something a little louder, a little ruder, or a little more shocking than what came before, simply because audiences have already heard so many earlier versions of similar jokes. Whether or not this fully explains the shift in how people describe Peter, it offers one reasonable explanation for why a character introduced as goofy and endearing might, after so many additional years and so many additional episodes, increasingly be described using much sharper, harsher language instead. Alongside this shift toward crude and mean-spirited language, critics have also also frequently pointed to another specific comparison when discussing Peter Griffin, one directly tied to a completely different, separate television character. Criticism of Peter has often centered on his similarities to Homer Simpson, both in personality and in comedic style. This comparison deserves real attention since it points towards something much bigger than just two individual cartoon fathers happening to resemble each other by coincidence. Homer Simpson, the father at the center of The Simpsons, had already become one of the most famous and successful animated characters in television history by the time Family Guy first premiered in 1999.
As already discussed earlier in this story, The Simpsons had begun airing a full decade earlier in 1989, and had already proven that an animated family comedy built around a foolish, bumbling father could succeed at the highest possible level on American television. Fox, the same network that would later give Family Guy its start, had already seen firsthand just how large and devoted an audience this kind of show could attract. Given this history, it is not surprising that critics, watching a new animated family comedy premiere on the very same network only a decade later, would immediately look for points of comparison between the two shows. Both center on a father figure who is loud, not especially intelligent, often clumsy, and prone to embarrassing or ridiculous behavior in front of his own family. Both fathers hold jobs that place them within a working class or blue-collar setting, rather than a wealthy or highly educated one.
Both are surrounded by a wife who tends to be more level-headed and responsible, and by children who each carry their own distinct personality traits and struggles. On the surface, the basic outline connecting Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson is genuinely easy to see, and critics comparing the two shows were not inventing a connection out of nothing. Where the comparison grows more complicated, and where a meaningful amount of critical disagreement has centered, is in exactly how similar the two characters and their surrounding shows actually are, once you look past this surface-level outline. Some critics have used the comparison in a fairly neutral, observational way, simply noting that Family Guy clearly drew inspiration from an already successful format that The Simpsons had established years earlier.
Other critics have used the comparison in a much sharper, more critical way, suggesting that Family Guy leaned too heavily on a formula that had already been built and proven successful by another show, rather than developing something they considered to feel fully original in its own right. This particular criticism, the idea that Family Guy borrowed too closely from an existing formula, connects in an interesting way back to everything already established earlier in this story about how Peter Griffin was actually built. His voice came directly from a real security guard McFarlane had known during his college years. His physical design was a redesign of an earlier character McFarlane had created himself for a college thesis film years before Family Guy existed. His personality was shaped by McFarlane's own memories of loud, opinionated men from his childhood in New England. None of this original creative material actually came from The Simpsons at all.
The foundation of who Peter Griffin is, at least as far as McFarlane's own explanations of the character's origins go, traces back to McFarlane's own personal life and creative work, built years before Family Guy ever reached television. At the same time, it is also true that both shows exist within the same broader category of storytelling. Both are animated, both are built around a family led by a bumbling father, and both aired on the same network. Sharing a broad category with another successful show does not automatically mean one show copied the other, but it does mean that comparisons between the two were always going to be common and, in many cases, difficult for critics to avoid entirely. Whenever a new show enters a space already occupied by something extremely successful and well-known, at least some of the conversation around that new show will naturally involve comparing it to whatever came before. Where the two characters tend to differ most clearly comes down to tone. Homer Simpson's foolishness is often played with a certain warmth and gentleness sitting underneath it,
even when he is behaving badly or making poor decisions. Peter Griffin's behavior, especially as the show continued for many additional seasons, increasingly leaned into sharper, cruder, and more aggressive territory, the exact shift already discussed at the start of this section. This growing difference in tone likely explains why critics comparing the two characters have not simply treated them as identical copies of one another, but instead have used the comparison specifically to highlight how Peter's harsher edges set him apart from Homer's more consistently gentle foolishness, even while both characters share the same basic role within their respective shows. It is worth being clear about exactly what this shift in critical language does and does not mean.
A change from being described as goofy and endearing toward being described as crude and mean-spirited does not mean that every single critic or every single viewer came to dislike Peter Griffin as the show continued. Reception growing more mixed means exactly that, mixed, not universally negative. Plenty of longtime viewers have continued watching the show for decades, still finding real enjoyment in Peter's chaotic energy and unpredictable humor, even as some critics grew more skeptical of where
that humor was heading. At the same time, this shift does reflect something real and worth acknowledging honestly, rather than pretending that critical opinion of Peter stayed exactly the same across the entire run of the show. This growing divide in opinion also connects directly back to something already covered earlier in this story: the specific comedic tools the show built its identity around.
The cutaway gags, the escalating chicken fights, and especially the willingness to build entire musical numbers around genuinely serious, real-world subjects all reflect a show willing to push further than many of its competitors, rather than staying within safer, more predictable comedic territory. A show built this deliberately around pushing boundaries was always going to eventually reach a point where some portion of its audience felt that the pushing had gone further than they personally found comfortable or funny, even while another portion of the audience continued to enjoy exactly that same willingness to go further than other shows dared to go. There is also something worth noting about how criticism of a long-running character tends to build up gradually, rather than shifting suddenly overnight. Nobody watching an early episode of Family Guy in 1999 or 2000 was likely thinking about how critics would describe Peter Griffin more than 2 decades later. Each individual episode, each individual joke, and each individual season added one more small piece onto a much larger, slowly accumulating picture of who this character had become over time. No single episode alone caused critics to begin describing Peter using sharper, harsher language. It was the steady accumulation of hundreds of episodes stretched across more than 20 years that gradually built toward the more divided reception the character eventually received. This pattern is not unique to Peter Griffin alone. Many long-running television characters across many different shows experience some version of this same shift over time. A character introduced with a clear, simple, likable identity often grows more complicated the longer a show continues. Sometimes because writers deliberately push the character in new directions to keep things interesting, and sometimes simply because audiences themselves change over the years, bringing new expectations and new sensitivities to a character that was originally built to fit a very different television landscape decades earlier. What audiences and critics found funny, acceptable, or even genuinely admirable in the late 1990s and early 2000s does not always match exactly what later audiences, watching the exact same style of jokes years afterward, consider funny or acceptable in the same way. None of this changes the basic, verified facts about how Peter Griffin was built and where he came from, all of which remain exactly as accurate now as they were at the very beginning of this story. He was still shaped by a real security guard from McFarlane's college years. He still carries a design rooted in an even earlier character from McFarlane's own student thesis film. His comedic tools, from cutaway gags to musical numbers, still function exactly the way they were built to function from the earliest years of the show forward. What has changed is not any of these underlying facts about the character himself, but rather how a growing and increasingly divided audience of critics and viewers has chosen to talk about him, evaluate him, and place him within the wider history of American television comedy. This growing divide in critical opinion arrived during the very same stretch of years when the show itself continued breaking records, continued getting renewed season after season, and continued reaching new milestones that very few other television programs in history have ever managed to reach. A character can remain genuinely divisive among critics while the show built around him keeps growing, keeps expanding its reach, and keeps proving itself financially valuable enough to remain on air for decades. These two things, critical division and continued long-term success, are not contradictions. They can, and often do, exist side by side within the same long-running series. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding exactly how Family Guy managed to keep growing and keep breaking records, even while critical opinion of its central character grew more mixed over time, requires looking closely at what actually happened to the show and its production during its most recent years. That part of the story involves a major change to one of the show's other longtime characters, a historic recognition from one of television's most respected awards ceremonies, and a record-breaking
life-changing business decision that would carry Peter Griffin and the entire Griffin family well into the years still ahead. Section 10. Recasting, Records, and Renewal. Every long-running television show eventually reaches a point where the people involved in making it have to make hard choices about how the show should keep growing and changing without losing what made it work in the first place. For Family Guy, one of the most significant of these choices arrived in the summer of 2020, and it involved a character who had been part of the show since its very first episode. Cleveland Brown had been voiced by Mike Henry since Family Guy premiered back in January of 1999. Henry was not simply a voice actor brought in to read lines.
He was also a writer and producer on the show, someone who had been part of the creative team behind the scenes for the entire run of the series, eventually becoming a full main cast member in 2005. Over the course of more than 20 years, Henry gave voice to Cleveland, a soft-spoken and steady presence among Peter's circle of friends, along with several other characters on the show, including a character named Herbert and a character named Bruce. On June 26, 2020, Mike Henry made an announcement that surprised many longtime fans of the show. He said he would be stepping down from voicing Cleveland Brown after 20 years in the role. Henry explained his reasoning directly and simply. He said that persons of color should play characters of color. Cleveland Brown is a black character, while Henry himself is white, and Henry made clear that he had come to believe the role should be given to a performer who actually shared that background, rather than continuing to play the part himself. This decision did not happen in isolation. Around this same period, several other animated shows made similar choices, with white actors stepping away from voicing black or other characters of color that they had played for years. This shift reflected a broader conversation happening across the television and film industry at the time, about who gets to voice which characters, and about a practice some had begun describing as a kind of digital blackface, meaning a white performer using their voice to portray a black character on screen. Henry's decision meant that Family Guy needed to find a new voice for one of its longest-running and most familiar characters. This search led to a rather unusual and interesting outcome. A young performer named Arif Zahir, who went by the name Azers online, had built a following on YouTube specifically by doing impressions of Cleveland Brown. After Henry's announcement, Zahir created a video honoring Henry and openly stated that he hoped to try out for the role himself, even starting an online petition asking Fox executives to consider him for the part. According to Family Guy's showrunner Richard Appel, the production team took this fan interest seriously. He explained that once they saw the petition and the response around it, they knew they needed to consider Zahir seriously as a candidate. The casting process itself involved a wide search, with many talented performers auditioning for the role, before the list of candidates eventually narrowed down to one person. On September 25, 2020, it was officially announced that Arif Zahir would become the new voice of Cleveland Brown, beginning with the show's 19th season. Zahir has described studying Henry's performance closely, going all the way back to the earliest days of Family Guy and through Henry's later work on the spin-off series The Cleveland Show, in order to honor what Henry had built with the character while still bringing his own voice and energy to the role going forward. Henry, for his part, expressed support for the change, stating that he welcomed Zahir to the team and had confidence in his understanding and respect for the character. Henry remained a part of the Family Guy voice cast, continuing to play other characters on the show even after stepping away from Cleveland. Around this same broader period, Family Guy was also achieving something rare within the history of television, a level of recognition that very few animated shows had ever managed to reach. In 2009, the series was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. This nomination placed Family Guy in extremely rare company. To understand exactly how rare, it helps to know that the last time an animated series had been nominated in this same category before Family Guy was The Flintstones, all the way back in 1961. This meant that Family Guy achieved something that had not happened for an animated show in generations, standing as recognition that the series was being taken seriously by the television industry as genuine, high-quality comedy, not simply as a cartoon competing in its own, separate, lesser-regarded category. As the years continued to pass, Family Guy kept adding to its list of achievements simply by continuing to exist and continuing to produce new episodes season after season. Longevity itself became one of the clearest markers of the show's success. As of 2025, Family Guy stands as the fourth longest-running scripted primetime series in North American television history. Very few shows of any kind, animated or otherwise, ever reach a milestone like this. Reaching this level of longevity required surviving two separate cancellations early in its run, rebuilding itself almost entirely from scratch after nearly 3 years off the air, and then continuing to produce new content steadily for roughly 2
more decades after that unlikely revival. This long-term stability was reinforced even further through a major business decision made in the spring of 2025. On April 2nd, 2025, Fox and Disney Television Studios announced a large renewal deal covering several of their long-running animated comedies at once. As part of this deal, Family Guy was renewed for 4 additional seasons, extending its run through the 2028 to 2029 television season. This renewal came alongside similar long-term commitments made to The Simpsons and Bob's Burgers, and it also brought back American Dad, another animated series created in part by Seth MacFarlane, returning that show to Fox after a period spent airing on a different network.
Industry coverage at the time referred to this agreement as a mega deal, reflecting just how significant and unusual it was for a network to commit this many years in advance to several established animated series all at the same time. This renewal meant that the character first sketched out by a college student working on a thesis film, first given a voice inspired by a security guard on a New England campus, first canceled, not once, but twice within his earliest years on television, was now guaranteed a place on national television for years still to come. Few creative projects manage this kind of staying power. Fewer still manage it after surviving the kind of early instability Family Guy faced during its first few seasons on the air. Looking back across this entire story, from a quiet dorm room screening of a college thesis film to a major renewal deal securing new episodes years into the future, it becomes clear just how unlikely each individual step along the way actually was. A professor had to believe enough in a student film to mail it somewhere bigger. A major cartoon studio had to take a chance on a very young animator. A network had to be willing to hand over a modest budget and a real opportunity based on a hand-built home pitch. A show canceled once had to somehow claw its way back for a third season, only to be canceled again shortly after. An audience nobody at Fox had fully accounted for had to discover that same canceled show through late-night reruns and DVD sales strong enough to break real records. And a character built from real memories of a real person had to prove sturdy enough to carry a show through more than 2 decades of change, criticism, controversy, and continued growth. Peter Griffin began as nothing more than an idea, shaped by one young man's careful attention to the world around him, refined slowly over years of quiet, steady work, long before any camera or microphone ever captured his voice. What grew out of that quiet beginning became one of the longest-running, most widely recognized characters in the entire history of American television, still very much alive, still airing new episodes, and still, after everything, sitting at the center of a story that started small and somehow never stopped growing. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.